How shall I address him? Kovalev wondered. From his uniform, his hat, everything about him. He must be a state councilor. Damned if I know what to do. He approached and cleared his throat, but the nose never even changed his pious posture and remained absorbed in his worship. Excuse me, sir, Kovalev said, scraping up all his courage. Yes, the nose said, turning around. I don't know how to put it, sir. I would say, it seems you ought to know where you belong. And where do I find you, of all places? In church? You must surely agree. Pardon me, but I can't make neither head nor tail of what you're saying. Just what do you want? Kovalev tried to think how he could explain to the nose what he had in mind, and taking a deep breath said, Of course, sir, for my part. But after all, I am a major, you know, and it's most improper in my position to walk around without a nose. Some old woman selling peeled oranges by the Voskresenskiy Bridge might be able to get along without a nose, but for someone who is almost certain of a high administrative appointment, you can judge for yourself, sir. I really fail to understand. At this point, Kovalev shrugged. You'll excuse me, but if this affair were handled according to the Code of Honor and Duty, you can see for yourself. I don't see anything, the nose said. Kindly come to the point. Sir, Kovalev said with dignity, I don't know how to interpret your words. The matter is quite clear, I believe. Unless you are trying... Don't you realize that you are my nose? The nose looked at the major and frowned slightly. You're mistaken, sir. I'm all on my own. Moreover, there couldn't possibly have been close relations between us, judging by your dress. You must be employed by the Senate, or possibly by the Ministry of Justice, whereas my field is science. And having said this, the nose turned away and resumed his prayers. Kovalev was now completely at a loss. Then he heard the pleasant rustle of a feminine dress. He saw a middle-aged lady covered with lace, and with her a pretty slender thing in a white dress which set off a very moving waistline, and with a straw hat as light as whipped cream. Behind them walked a tall man with side whiskers and a very complicated collar. Kovalev worked his way toward them, pulled up the spotless collar of his shirt front to make sure it showed, straightened the seals that hung on a golden chain, and concentrated his attention on the young lady who, like a spring blossom, raised her white hand with its half-transparent fingers to her forehead. And Kovalev's smile spread twice as wide when, under the hat, he made out a chin of a tender whiteness, and a cheek touched by the early spring coloring of a rose. But then he jumped back as though burned. He had remembered that instead of a nose, he had absolutely nothing, and the tears sprang to his eyes. He turned to the gentleman dressed as a state councilor to tell him that he was nothing but a fraud and a crook, nothing but his, Kovalev's, personally owned nose. But the nose was nowhere to be seen. He must have driven off on another official visit. Kovalev was in despair. He retraced his steps, stopped for a while under the colonnade, and looked intently around him in the hope of catching sight of the nose. He remembered that the nose had had a plumed hat and a gold-braided uniform, but he hadn't noticed his greatcoat, or the color of his carriage, or his horses, or even whether he had had a footman up behind him, and if so, what livery he wore. And then there were so many carriages rushing back and forth, all going so fast that he would have had difficulty in picking one out, no way of stopping it anyway. It was a lovely sunny day. Nevsky Avenue was thronged with people. From the Central Police Station to Anichkin Bridge, ladies poured over the sidewalks in a colorful cascade. There went an acquaintance of his, a court counselor, whom he addressed as Lieutenant Colonel, especially in the presence of outsiders. Then Kovalev saw Yaruzhkin, head clerk in the Senate, a good friend who always lost whenever they played cards together. And there was another major, another Caucasus-made collegiate assessor, beckoning. "God damn it," Kovalev said. "What the hell does he want from me, cabbie?" "To the police commissioners." He got into the cab and kept exhorting the cabbie again and again. "Come on, let's go, quick! Now turn into Ivanovskaya Street." "Is the commissioner in?" he called out as soon as he entered the house. "No, sir," the doorman answered. "He left only a minute ago." "That's really too much." "Yes, sir," the doorman said. "If you'd come a minute earlier, you'd have caught him." Kovalev, still holding his handkerchief to his face, got back into the cab and shouted in a desperate voice, "Get going!" "Where to?" "Straight ahead." "Straight ahead, but this is a dead end. Shall I go right or left?" Kovalev was caught off balance and forced to give the matter some thought. In his position, he ought first to go to the National Security Administration, not because it was directly connected with the police, but because its orders would be acted on more rapidly than those of others. Certainly it was no use taking his grievance to the scientific department where the nose claimed to have a post. At best, it would be unwise since, judging by his statement that he had never seen Kovalev before, it was obvious that he held nothing sacred and he might lie whenever he found it convenient. So Kovalev was about to tell the cabman to drive him to the National Security Administration when it occurred to him that the crook and the imposter, who had just behaved so unscrupulously toward him, might very well try to slip out of town. In which case finding him would be quite hopeless, or would take, God forbid, a whole month perhaps. Finally, he had what seemed like a divine inspiration. He decided to go straight to the press building, to have an advertisement put in the papers with a detailed description of the nose and all his aspects, so that anyone who met him could turn him over to Kovalev, or at least inform him of the nose's whereabouts. So, having decided this, he told the cabman to take him to the press building, and during the entire ride, he kept pummeling him on the back with his fist and shouting, "Faster, damn you, faster!" "Really, sir," the cabman said, shaking his head and flicking the reins at his horse, which had hair as long as a lapdog's. At last the cab came to a stop, and Kovalev, panting, burst into the small outer office where a gray-haired, bespectacled employee in an ancient frock coat was seated at a table, his pen clenched between his teeth, counting out the change someone had paid in. "Who handles advertisements here?" shouted Kovalev. "Ah," he said, "good morning." "Good morning, sir," the gray-haired employee said, raising his eyes for a moment and lowering them again to the little piles of coins before him. "I want to insert... Excuse me, would you mind waiting just a moment, please?" the employee said, writing down a figure with his right hand while his left hand moved 2 beads on his abacus. A footman, whose gold-braided livery and whole appearance testified to his service in an aristocratic house, stood by the old employee holding a piece of paper in his hand and, to prove his worldliness, started chattering away. "Believe me, I'm quite sure the mutt isn't worth 80 kopecks. In fact, I wouldn't give 80 kopecks. I wouldn't give 8 kopecks if you ask me. But the Countess loves that cur. She has to if she's willing to give 100 rubles to the person who finds it. Since we are among people who understand, I'll tell you one thing. It's all a matter of taste. I can understand a dog lover, but then go and get a deerhound or maybe a poodle. Then if you want to spend 500 or 1,000 on it, it's only natural. But in my opinion, when you pay, you are entitled to a real dog." The elderly employee was listening to this speech with an important expression and was counting the number of letters in the text of the advertisement the manservant had handed him. The room was full of old women, shopkeepers, and doormen, all holding pieces of paper on which advertisements had been written out. In one, a coachman, sober and dependable, was for hire. Another announced that a carriage with very little mileage, brought from Paris in 1814, was for sale. A 19-year-old girl, a washerwoman's assistant, but suitable for other work too, wanted employment. Also for sale were an excellent handsome cab, one spring missing, and a young 17-year-old dappled gray horse, as well as a consignment of turnip and radish seeds straight from London. A summer house with a 2-carriage coach house and a piece of land very suitable for planting a lovely birch wood. Another advertisement invited persons desirous of buying second-hand shoe soles to present themselves in a certain sales room between 8 a.m. and 3 p.m.